I used to think potted plants died in the summer because they lacked fertilizer. Whenever a plant started to weaken, I would buy another product, hoping it would recover. But after years of gardening, I realized I had been blaming fertilizer for the wrong problem. Most potted plants do not die because they lack nutrients. They die because their roots are being cooked inside a pot that is as hot as an oven. Because the soil dries out just a few hours after watering. Or because the roots are trapped in an environment that was poorly designed from the beginning. What's surprising is that most of those problems can be prevented before you even place a plant in the pot. Today, I'm going to show you how I prepare a container from the start to solve the three biggest challenges of container gardening: temperature, water, and pot structure. Because when roots stay cooler, moisture remains more consistent, and plants have the right space to grow, caring for them throughout the summer becomes much easier. Why potted plants are harder than you think. The first thing to understand is that plants in containers are playing a completely different game from plants growing in the ground. A plant in a garden can spread its roots in many directions to find water and suitable temperatures. But a plant in a container is limited by the walls of the pot on every side. That is why the same type of plant can thrive in a garden bed but continue to struggle in a container. Not because the plant has changed, but because its growing environment has changed completely. And the first issue I always try to solve is temperature. The first thing I do: control temperature. When preparing a new container, the first thing I think about is not fertilizer. I think about temperature. That may sound a little strange because most gardeners usually think about soil, fertilizer, or plant selection first. But after many years of growing plants in containers, I realized that temperature causes more problems than I ever imagined. I first started noticing this after losing a few beautiful boxwoods near my driveway and garage door. The plants were watered regularly. They showed no obvious signs of pests or disease, and I did not see any major signs of nutrient deficiency. Yet somehow, they continued to decline with each heat wave. At first, I thought the plants needed more fertilizer. Then I thought maybe I was not watering enough. And, like many gardeners, my first reaction was to keep adding things above ground. But eventually I realized the problem was not in the leaves. It was in the container. More specifically, it was in the root zone. If you have ever placed your hand on a black pot during a summer afternoon, you know exactly what that feels like. The side of the pot can become so hot that you almost do not want to touch it. Metal planters and other heat-absorbing materials can become even hotter. What I did not really think about for many years was that all of that heat does not simply disappear. It moves into the soil inside the container. And eventually, the roots have to live in that environment for many hours every single day. What is interesting is that most plants can tolerate a great deal of sunlight on their leaves, but roots are a completely different story. When the root zone becomes too hot, the plant begins to shift into survival mode instead of growth mode. You may see the plant wilt at the end of the day. You may notice the leaves losing vigor. And the natural response for most people is to add more water or more fertilizer. But many times the real problem is not water or fertilizer. The problem is that the roots are under constant heat stress. That is why, when preparing a new container, I always look at which side of the pot will receive the most afternoon sun. If it is an especially hot location, I deal with that area before adding any soil. I usually place a layer of bubble wrap against the side of the container that receives the most heat. I do not wrap the entire container. I only focus on the area that gets the most intense heat during the day. The idea is not to keep the container completely cool. That is almost impossible. The goal is to create an air barrier that helps slow the transfer of heat from the container wall into the root zone. That is why I like using bubble wrap. It is inexpensive, easy to find, and almost anyone can try it using materials they already have available. Will it turn a container in the middle of summer into a perfect growing environment? Certainly not. But it can help reduce some of the heat stress that the roots experience every day. And after years of testing all kinds of different tricks, I realized that keeping roots cooler is only half the battle. Even when temperature is managed more effectively, container-grown plants still face another enemy: water loss. The second thing I do: control water. After dealing with temperature, the next thing I think about is water. Because the hotter the pot gets, the faster water is lost under strong summer sun. At first, I just watered more, but then I realized I was treating the symptom, not the root cause. Instead of constantly adding water in a passive way, I try to keep that water in the soil longer by using my first tool, which is a layer of mulch, such as pine bark, dry leaves, or wood chips, placed on the surface right after planting. This mulch layer not only reduces evaporation and keeps the root zone more stable, but it also cools the soil surface very effectively, turning it into a solution that addresses both of the biggest problems in container gardening at the same time: temperature and moisture. For pots placed in hard-to-reach locations or exposed to full sun all day, I also use water-storing crystals, but I always let them fully expand overnight before mixing them in, so I know their exact volume and avoid pushing soil up over the rim. Another small trick I use is grouping multiple pots together to create a small microclimate that blocks wind and reduces water loss, helping maintain a balanced environment with both moisture and oxygen for the roots. Once temperature and water are under control, I then start thinking about the internal structure of the pot itself, because many failures actually come from how we design the container from the very beginning, not from the plant. The third thing I do: choose the right potting soil for summer. One big mistake is using native garden soil for containers in the summer. This type of soil is too fine and too heavy, and under strong sun, it quickly compacts into a cement-like block that locks the roots in place. On the other hand, if the mix contains too much coarse coconut coir or sand, water will drain straight out of the drainage holes right after watering, leaving the plant unable to absorb enough moisture and quickly drying out. My summer potting mix always needs to balance two things: good drainage, but also good moisture retention, by combining loose organic soil, perlite, and a small amount of peat moss. Perlite creates air pockets that allow the roots to access oxygen, while peat moss acts like tiny sponges that quietly hold the ideal level of moisture within the soil structure. Choosing the right loose, well-aerated soil is the foundation that allows all the watering and temperature control techniques above to work at their full potential. The fourth thing I do: build the pot structure. After dealing with temperature and water, the next thing I think about is the structure of the pot. And the first question I always ask is, how much soil does this plant actually need? When I first started gardening, I always thought that whatever the depth of the pot was, I had to fill it completely with soil. But after many years of growing in containers, I realized that many plants do not use that entire depth. Plants like boxwood, azalea, camellia, and many other common ornamental plants usually have relatively shallow fibrous root systems. Most of their root activity happens in the top 12 to 18 inches of soil. That is why, with large containers, I often place an old nursery pot upside down at the bottom before adding soil. This helps reduce the amount of potting mix needed and makes the container significantly lighter. The important thing is not to block the drainage holes. After placing the smaller pot at the bottom, I always make sure water can still drain properly. Then I add potting soil on top as usual. The goal is to concentrate good quality soil in the area where the roots will actually grow instead of filling the entire bottom with unnecessary soil. Of course, I do not use this method for every plant. If I am growing a plant with a strong taproot or a plant meant to live in a container for many years, I want to give it as much root space as possible. But for most ornamental plants and typical container shrubs, this is one of the simplest ways to save soil, reduce weight, and make containers easier to move later on. At this point, the container has been optimized for temperature, water, and structure. But interestingly, after many years of gardening, I realized that success does not only come from what I do, it also comes from what I have stopped doing. 3 things I've stopped doing. After preparing hundreds of containers over many years, I realized something interesting. A lot of progress in my garden did not come from things I started doing. It came from things I stopped doing. The first thing I stopped doing was putting rocks or gravel at the bottom of pots to help drainage. This is probably one of the most common pieces of advice I heard when I first started gardening. Today, I no longer use rocks or gravel to create a fake drainage layer at the bottom of pots. If I need to reduce the weight of a large container, I use something lightweight and hollow, like an upside-down plastic pot, but I still keep the growing medium above it continuous and suitable for the roots. The second thing I stopped doing was placing black pots or heat-absorbing containers in the hottest, most intense sun exposure during the day. After I started paying attention to how hot pot walls actually got in midsummer, I realized just how much heat they absorb. The third thing is watering every day with only a small amount of water. This type of watering keeps the surface moist, but the lower root zone does not receive enough water. Over time, roots tend to stay near the surface, where temperatures fluctuate the most and dry out the fastest. Nowadays, I prefer watering more deeply and less frequently. This encourages roots to grow down into more stable zones below instead of staying near the surface. And if, after everything I've said, someone forced me to remove all the tips in this video and keep only one, I already know exactly what I would choose. If I could only keep one thing. After all these years of gardening, testing different tools and methods, I sometimes ask myself, if tomorrow someone took everything away and only allowed me to keep one change from this video, what would I keep? It's not that tricks like bubble wrap, water-storing crystals, or inverted pots don't work. They do. But if I had to choose one ultimate and most important tool, I would choose mulch. Mulch may sound boring. It's not a new invention or a flashy product that stands out in a store. But the longer I garden, the more I realize it solves more problems at once than almost anything else. It reduces soil surface temperature on hot days, slows water evaporation between waterings, and helps stabilize soil after heavy rain. That is why every container I grow ends up with a mulch layer on top. Over time, many types of mulch also break down and improve the root environment itself. Looking back, you can see that most of the solutions in this video actually revolve around one word: stability. Roots absolutely hate extreme change. They do not like it when today is too hot and tomorrow is too cold. They also cannot handle being soaked in the morning and bone dry by afternoon. A healthy plant does not come from sudden bursts of growth. It comes from roots living in a stable environment long enough to do their job properly, absorbing water and locking in nutrients. That is why I always prioritize temperature, then water, and only then fertilizer. A strong root system can make excellent use of nutrients, but a stressed root system can collapse even when everything it needs is available. These changes do not create overnight miracles, but over time, they quietly produce stronger, more stable plants and make gardening much easier overall. What happens next? One of the biggest mistakes I ever made was expecting results too quickly. I add mulch today, and expect the plant to look different tomorrow. I change my watering routine this weekend and expect a clear difference next week. But roots do not operate on the speed of impatience. Usually, the first change I notice is not in the leaves. It is that I need to water less often. The soil no longer dries out as quickly. The temperature inside the pot is more stable, and the plant no longer shows stress signs in the hottest part of the afternoon. After that, I start to see changes in the top growth. Leaves become more stable. Growth becomes more even. Irregular wilting starts to decrease. What is interesting is that many people see this and assume the plant is responding to a new fertilizer or a special product. But many times, what actually changed is not nutrients. It is the root environment. When roots are no longer constantly fighting extreme temperatures, water shortages, or unstable conditions, they begin doing their job properly. They absorb water more efficiently. They take up nutrients more consistently. And the entire plant above reflects that. That is why I always see things like mulch, water management, and pot structure as long-term investments. They do not create overnight miracles, but they often produce healthier plants throughout the entire growing season. And in the end, that is what I really want from a container garden. Not short bursts of explosive growth, but long-lasting stability from the beginning of the season to the end.